72 tank cars full of crude oil, 5 locomotives, no driver, a 1.2% grade, barely visible to the eye. And just before 1 in the morning, on a darkened stretch of track in rural Quebec, thousands of tons of steel began to move on their own. The train traveled approximately 7.2 miles, reaching a speed of 65 miles per hour. When it entered the center of Lac-Mégantic, 63 tank cars derailed, spilling around 6 million liters of petroleum crude oil. 47 people were killed. The heart of the town was destroyed. But the train had been parked for the night. It was supposed to be secure. Instead, every safeguard that should have stopped it had already been quietly weakened. To understand what failed, you first need to understand the system that was supposed to prevent it. Freight trains parked on a gradient are held in place by brakes. Trains are equipped with air brake systems, including the independent brake, which acts on the locomotives, and the automatic brake, which controls braking throughout the entire train. On top of these, hand brakes, mechanical devices tightened manually on individual cars, provide a physical, non-powered means of securing the train. The principle is redundancy. Air brakes provide braking force. Hand brakes provide a mechanical backup. Railway rules require that hand brakes alone must be capable of holding an unattended train, and that capability must be verified by a test. That verification is critical. If the air brakes are released and the hand brakes alone can hold the train is secure. If it moves, more braking force is needed. The system works, provided every layer is actually in place. On the evening of 5 July 2013, a Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway freight train arrived in Nantes, Quebec. It was carrying 7.7 million liters of petroleum crude oil in 72 DOT-111 tank cars, originating in Newtown, North Dakota, and bound for St. John, New Brunswick. A single engineer crewed it, a cost-saving practice permitted at the time, but one that concentrated all operational responsibility in a single pair of hands. After arriving at Nantes, the engineer parked the train on a descending grade on the main track rather than pulling it onto the nearby siding. The TSB found this had become MMA's standard practice because the siding was being used to store other rail cars. Whether a derail device on the siding would have prevented the train from reaching Lac-Mégantic remained uncertain, but parking on the main line removed whatever protection the siding might have offered. The engineer applied hand brakes on all 5 locomotives and 2 other cars, 7 in total, before leaving the train for the night. MMA's own rules required a minimum of 9 hand brakes for a train of this size. 7 were not enough. But there was a problem deeper than the number. Railway rules required that the hand brakes alone be capable of holding an unattended train, and that this capability be verified by a test. But that night, the locomotive's independent air brakes remained applied during the test. The train was therefore being held by a combination of hand brakes and air brakes. The test appeared to confirm that the train was secure. It had not actually established whether the hand brakes alone could hold it. They could not. And then a new variable entered the sequence. The lead locomotive's engine had previously been repaired using an epoxy-like material that did not meet the required specifications. The TSB found that the repair was chosen because a standard repair would have taken more time and cost more, while there was pressure to return the locomotive to service. The repair failed in service. Engine surges and excessive smoke followed. Oil eventually accumulated inside the turbocharger, where it overheated and ignited. At approximately 11:40 that night, a fire ignited in the lead locomotive's smokestack. The Nantes Fire Department responded. Following railway instructions, the firefighters shut down the locomotive before extinguishing the fire. The fire was extinguished, but the locomotive was not restarted. MMA did not send the engineer back to the train. Instead, a track maintenance employee was sent to the scene. He was unfamiliar with the operation of locomotives. By approximately 0013, MMA track maintenance employees had arrived from Lac-Mégantic. The track foreman consulted with the rail traffic controller. The firefighters left. The train was reported secure. It was not. With the locomotives shut down, the air compressor could no longer replenish the air used by the braking system. Air began leaking from the system. The pressure fell gradually. weakening the locomotive air brakes until the remaining braking force could no longer hold the train. At 00:58:21, the train began to move. No one saw it happen. The track from Nantes to Lac-Mégantic descends on a 1.2% grade, barely perceptible to the eye, but enough for gravity to accelerate thousands of tons of steel toward the town below. The train traveled approximately 7.2 miles. It reached 65 miles per hour, and at around 1:15 in the morning, it entered Lac-Mégantic. In the center of town, the train entered a curve with a speed restriction far below the train's speed. It could not stay on the track. The tank cars derailed, several ruptured, around 6 million liters of crude oil escaped. Then came the fires and explosions. 40 buildings were destroyed, 53 vehicles were destroyed, approximately 2,000 residents were evacuated, and 47 people were killed. Many had been gathered in the center of town on a Friday night. They had no reason to know that a train carrying millions of liters of crude oil was moving toward them with no driver aboard. The TSB's investigation would later add another dimension to the cargo itself. The petroleum crude oil in the tank cars was more volatile than described on the shipping documents. The oil had been classified as a packing group 3 substance, the least hazardous category for crude. In reality, it was a packing group 2 product, with a volatility comparable to gasoline. That misclassification had consequences. It meant the cargo was being transported under a classification that did not reflect its actual volatility and hazard. And when those cars ruptured at speed, the low flash point of the oil meant it ignited almost immediately. DOT 111 tank cars had already been the subject of long-standing safety concerns about their structural vulnerability in severe derailments. At Lac-Mégantic, almost every derailed car was breached. The cargo was more dangerous than anyone transporting it knew, and the containers were already known to be inadequate. The TSB's investigation concluded that no single cause produced the disaster. Investigators identified 18 factors that played a role. They spread across several layers of the system: train securement, locomotive maintenance, employee training, company procedures, tank car safety, and regulatory oversight. The lead locomotive, MMA 5017, had a different electrical configuration from the other locomotives in the fleet. That configuration meant that shutting off its electrical power did not trigger an automatic penalty brake application, a safeguard that existed on the other units and could have provided another layer of braking force. One more defense was absent. The TSB concluded that the accident likely would have been prevented if the automatic brake on the rail cars had been properly applied as a backup. MMA had instructed its employees not to use the automatic brake when securing unattended trains. The TSB also found that MMA had a weak safety culture and lacked an effective safety management system for identifying and controlling operational risks. Investigators identified problems with training, employee monitoring, maintenance practices, and the condition of the railway's equipment. Transport Canada had not audited MMA frequently or thoroughly enough to ensure those risks were being properly managed. The failures were no longer concentrated in one component. They were distributed throughout the system. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and contested. 3 former MMA employees, locomotive engineer Thomas Harding, rail traffic controller Richard Labrie, and operations manager Jean Demetre, were each charged with 1 count of criminal negligence causing death. After 9 days of deliberation, the jury acquitted all 3. But the legal consequences did not end there. 6 former MMA employees subsequently pleaded guilty to violations of the Railway Safety Act relating to the securement of the train. 5 were fined $50,000 each. Thomas Harding received a conditional 6-month sentence to be served in the community. MMA's Canadian subsidiary was separately found guilty under the Fisheries Act for polluting the Rivière Chaudière and Lac-Mégantic, and was ordered to pay a $1 million fine, the maximum penalty. MMA itself had limited insurance coverage and later declared bankruptcy. The disaster nevertheless forced systemic change. Canada strengthened rules governing the securement of unattended trains. DOT 111 tank cars were prohibited from transporting flammable liquids, and tougher tank car standards were introduced. Regulators increased scrutiny of the transportation of dangerous goods. and requirements were introduced for crude oil to be properly tested and classified before it is shipped. But the story did not simply end with new regulations. The TSB continued to monitor unresolved safety recommendations, including measures concerning uncontrolled movements and regulatory oversight, because the underlying vulnerabilities in the system had taken years to develop. And new rules alone could not guarantee they would not reappear elsewhere. Lac-Mégantic was not caused by a single catastrophic failure. It was caused by the quiet erosion of the margins that were supposed to prevent one. 7 handbrakes applied when MMA's own rules required at least 9, and the TSB later determined that substantially more braking force was necessary to secure the train. A brake test that never established whether those handbrakes could hold the train alone. A locomotive repaired with materials that did not meet specifications. A lead unit whose electrical configuration bypassed an automatic braking safeguard. A company instruction that eliminated another layer of protection. Cargo that was more hazardous than its documentation stated, carried in tank cars already known to be vulnerable. A regulator that did not audit deeply enough to see the full extent of the risk. Each weakness, on its own, might have been survivable. Together, they formed a corridor through which gravity moved almost unopposed. The system didn't fail all at once. It failed one safeguard at a time, until there was almost nothing left between a sleeping town and thousands of tons of rolling steel. That is what makes Lac-Mégantic so important to understand. The disaster wasn't waiting inside one defective component. It was distributed across the entire system, in company procedures, maintenance decisions, regulatory gaps, and cargo that was never what its paperwork claimed. And by the time the train began moving, every failure had already happened. The question worth sitting with isn't who made the worst mistake. It's how many quiet compromises a system can absorb before gravity makes the decision for everyone. Subscribe to Null Theory for more investigations into the hidden weaknesses inside the systems we trust.